Greetings. I'm speaking at this time. This recording is taking place in July of 2020 in Central Florida. And I'm reading out of the book of Romans. As you know, we Christian commandment keepers are not to be troublemakers. It says in Romans 12 and verse 18, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. So we don't want to be the source, of trouble. We don't want to look for trouble. You've probably all heard the story about, I'll tell it this way, a man is waiting for a bus. I'll call him John. John is waiting for the bus, and lying down next to him is a dog. Tom comes over and says to John, does your dog bite? John says no. Tom goes over to pet the dog. The dog bites him. And Tom says, I thought you said your dog doesn't bite. And John said, yes, that's not my dog. Probably have heard that story like that. Well, unfortunately, King Josiah did something a little worse than that. He got involved in a quarrel that was not his. Righteous King Josiah. And it's like taking a dog and pulling the dog up by the ears. It's not something you want to do, especially, of course, if you don't know the dog. I want to go to Proverbs 26 and verse 17. Proverbs 26 and verse 17. He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel that is not his own is like one who takes a dog by the ears. So it's, don't get involved in some others' quarrels. Well, unfortunately, righteous King Josiah did that. I understand there was provocation. You could maybe somehow justify it, but it was an error of judgment. But let's talk about the positive side of King Josiah. You can read about him in 2 Kings 22 and 23. I want to go to the summary of his reign in 2 Chronicles. And I want to call this talk Looking Backward, Looking Forward. I'm looking backward to the beginnings of the exile of the house of Judah, which to this day has not totally come to an end. And to this day, Jews therefore have days of mourning in memory of the events that brought about the exile. But before those events, the positive side was a renewal of the covenant, a rededication of the people to the Sinaitic covenant under King Josiah, which you find in 2 Chronicles 34. And dire consequences were preserved. Were prophesied. The king was going to be preserved, but the nation not. Dire consequences were prophesied for the nation. And the nation really, even though it rededicated itself to the covenant, evidently was not able to maintain that standard. However, Josiah was told because of his righteousness, the problem would not occur in his day. And in verse 28 of 2 Chronicles 34, God makes this promise to King Josiah. Surely I will gather you to your fathers. So Josiah was, of course, going to die, as we all do. But here's the key. And you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. So he was going to be buried at a time when his nation would be at peace. And your eyes shall not see all the calamity which I will bring on this place and on its inhabitants. So they brought back word to the king. So he was given this message. And he purposed to bring the nation together, to recommit to the Sinaitic covenant, to keep the Passover. And in 2 Chronicles 35, now Josiah kept the Passover to the eternal in Jerusalem, And to slaughter the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. When you read the Old Testament, you find the Passover is talked about in terms of the day of the sacrifice. It wasn't the holy day, but it was a very important day. It was the day of the sacrifice of the Passover that prepared the way for the festival season, because the night after the sacrifice, they were going to eat what they had sacrificed to begin the festival. The first day of unleavened bread on the 15th day of the first month is the time when they would have eaten the lamb that they slaughtered on the 14th. So the 14th was something that was commanded of them before they ever left Egypt. As you know, the first Passover sacrifice was held even before the Sinaitic covenant, and so we continue that practice in a different way. In God's church today, we commemorate the 14th day of the first month. We do it at the beginning of the day. We have reasons for that. We do it at the beginning of the day, and we replace the sacrifice of the lamb with the taking of the unleavened bread and wine, and we remember the sacrifice of Christ, who was the antitype of the Passover. But if we go to 2 Chronicles 35, and he set the priests in their duties and encouraged them for the service of the house of the Eternal. Then he said to the Levites who taught all Israel, who were holy to the Eternal, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, built. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders. Now serve the Eternal, your God, and his people Israel. It may be that for some reason the ark was not in its proper place, and he was now going to make sure that it was placed where it needed to be placed. That could be a possible meaning here. And then he says, prepare yourselves according to your father's houses, according to your divisions, following the written instruction of David, king of Israel, and the written instruction of Solomon, his son. You can look back in the Old Testament about how David organized the worship service. Even though he was not able to build the temple, he gathered the materials, organized the Levites and priests. Then Solomon carried through, and of course under Solomon the temple was built, and the temple activities were begun under Solomon. Prepare yourselves, verse 4, according to your father's houses, according to your divisions, following the written instruction of David, king of Israel, and the written instruction, king of Solomon, his son. And stand in the holy place according to the divisions of the father's houses of your brethren, the lay people, and according to the division of the father's house of the Levites. So the children of Israel were going to come, and there were some remnants of the other tribes that were going to come and keep the Passover. The northern kingdom had been taken into captivity, and there were some remnants, there were some descendants of them there in the north, and there also were remnants of those who had fled and come to the south to live in Judah. And so they were going to be represented, and Judah and Benjamin, and of course the various Levitical families. And stand in the holy place according to the divisions of the father's houses of your brethren, the lay people, and according, of course that's added, but that's the meaning. And the word lay is added because we're talking here about the priesthood, which were the Levites who assisted the descendants of Aaron, who were also Levites, but of the descendants of Aaron. And the Aaronites were the priesthood. Levites were their assistants. Then we had the other people who were part of the nation. And according to the division of the father's house of the Levites. So slaughter the Passover offerings, consecrate yourselves, and prepare them for your brethren, that they may do according to the word of the Eternal by the hand of Moses. And it mentions that he himself, evidently as king of Judah, he had quite a bit of wealth, a lot more than the average person. You could wonder about that, but that was the way the situation was then, and he contributed though towards the Passover, he from his own livestock, and also others who were more prosperous were willing to donate and help others who maybe didn't have. So it was just a wonderful time of sharing from the top down Those who had more shared with those who didn't have so much, so that the holy day coming up could be properly celebrated. The festival, first day of unleavened bread and the festival, and then the seventh day of unleavened bread could be celebrated. Also, Konaniah, it mentions various names of people here and what they did, what they donated. So the service was prepared, and the priests stood in their places, and the Levites in their divisions, according to the king's command. After they slaughtered the Passover offerings, and the priests sprinkled the blood with their hands, while the Levites skinned the animals. Then they removed the burnt offerings, that they might give them to the divisions of the fathers' houses of the lay people to offer to the Eternal, as it is written in the book of Moses. So they did with the cattle. So it goes into detail, shows how at least at this moment there was a zeal and enthusiasm to do the right thing, to follow the details of the Old Testament ritual. And they roasted the Passover, on verse 13. And they roasted the Passover offerings with fire, according to the ordinance. But the other holy offerings they boiled in pots, in cauldrons, and in pans, and divided them quickly among all the lay people. So there was a lot of sharing and a lot of feasting as part of the days of unleavened bread. And so you see, if you see in the Bible that around the holy days is when these spiritual revivals would occur. You find in Nehemiah 8, around the autumn festival season, you find a great revival at that time. Later on in history, the spiritual revivals occur around these around these festival times. Then afterward, I'm in verse 14, they prepared portions for themselves, for the priests, because the priests, the sons of Aaron, were busy in offering burnt offerings and fat until night. Therefore the Levites prepared portions for themselves and for the priests, the sons of Aaron. And if you remember, there were divisions among the Levites, among the musicians and those who had various responsibilities, and that's talked about in verse 15. And the singers, the sons of Asaph, were in their places according to the command of David, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, the king's seer. Also the gatekeepers were at each gate. They did not have to leave their position because their brethren the Levites prepared portions for them. Well, that was nice. Those who were on security, they were taken care of. So while the service of the Eternal was prepared, the same day, to keep the Passover and to offer burnt offerings on the altar of the Eternal according to the command of King Josiah. So we find occasionally in the history of Judah, we don't find it in the history of Israel. There were some kings of Israel that had a relationship with God. We think about Jehu, for example, but Jehu didn't go far enough. And on the other hand, there were some kings of Judah who did really bring the people back to the way of life that was based in the Bible. And such a king was Josiah. He was the last of the righteous kings of Judah. And so he did direct at this time. This is in the 18th year of his reign. So he was an adult by this time. He had begun to reign as a child, but now he's a young adult. And of course he had the prophet Jeremiah there. And so Jeremiah would have been a force, a positive force at that time. Jeremiah was a priest living in the territory of Benjamin, and he would have had an influence at that time. I believe so. I believe he would have by that time already been functioning. And the children of Israel who were present kept the Passover at that time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. So you see how the Passover is given a special significance. The 14th day of the first month, the day of the sacrifice, and then immediately follows the 7 days of the festival. There had been no this is interesting in verse 18, the enthusiasm of the people. And I assume that what is meant by this passage, or you could speculate, but I think it has to do with the fact that the nation was smaller, but even so, we aren't dealing with the nation of Israel as it was under Solomon, which was a huge nation compared to Judah at this point. But probably what was positive about it is the percentage of those involved, and the zeal of those involved. That they did a very wonderful job of observing the festival in all its requirements, and very likely as high a percentage as ever of those there were actually participating. And in that sense, it was unique for in history, going all the way back to the days of Samuel, which is a very, very startling. But that's the comment here. So I'm in verse 18. There had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel the prophet, and none of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as Josiah kept, with the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So there was just a special spirit about this particular Passover that is so noteworthy that it's mentioned here in 2 Chronicles. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah, this Passover was kept. And of course, Josiah reigned all the way, I believe for 31 years altogether. So this is in the 18th year. But now we come to the end of his reign, much later on, and it's sad though, because he makes an error in judgment. Now he knew that he would not see the calamity that was going to come upon his people, and probably this words circulated around, so that his nation knew Josiah is a righteous king, and God has a wonderful relationship with Josiah, and as long as Josiah is around, we're going to be all right. Unfortunately, Josiah was not around as long as he might have been. He started his reign very young, and he could have reigned a very, very long time. But unfortunately, his reign was cut short because of an error in judgment. And once that happened, then the people would have been thinking, "Oh no, we've lost this righteous king. What's going to become of us?" Well, you can read the rest of the account. Unfortunately, the people did not maintain the standards that they should have maintained. Of course, there was a wicked king who came after, and it just didn't work out. After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates. He didn't come up to deal with Judah. He wasn't trying to pick a fight with the Jews. He was on his way to fight against the Chaldeans. A Neo-Babylonian empire had arisen. The Assyrians were beginning to decline, but Egypt was allied with Assyria. So they were going up to battle. So Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he sent messengers to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I have not come against you this day, but against the house with which I have war. For God commanded me to make haste. Refrain from meddling with God who is with me, lest he destroy you." Now, I don't know whether this was a true remark, but maybe he felt that this kind of remark would have influence on Josiah. That if we brought God into the picture, that it would influence Josiah to leave him alone. In any case, God was warning him. Whatever God may have said or not said to the Pharaoh of Egypt, he was warning Josiah through the Pharaoh. You don't need to get involved in this. You don't need to sort of show your loyalty to this rising Chaldean power. Judah was a nation like other nations, but it was also a theocracy, had a relationship with God. And it wasn't, there may have been times when nations might try to attack people of Israel, and God would miraculously defend them, or there may even be times when they would have to literally defend themselves, but God would inspire the battle to go their way. But that doesn't mean that they should be getting entangled in international alliances and getting involved in conflicts. It kind of reminds me, during this time of the year, we tend to think of our own history. July 4th has just occurred in America, and we tend to think of our own history. And our first president decided to serve 2 terms and then leave. And he had Alexander Hamilton, I believe, helped him with writing the farewell address. And what he was worried about was America getting involved in a conflict between the British and the French. He wanted his new, his young country to stay out of it. And he was warning the country also about getting too involved in alliances with other countries, because it kind of draws you into conflicts that really you don't need to be involved with. And but Israel, particularly as a theocracy, as God's nation, had to some degree be involved in international politics, because it was a nation. It wasn't purely a church. It was a theocracy. It was a nation that was also being run according to God's law, according to the Sinaitic covenant. But it didn't need to be getting involved in the intrigues of the ancient Middle East. And so he was warned, you just let us walk through the territory, just like you in ancient times asked the Edomites, just let us walk through. We're not going to bother you. You may remember that. And Edomites were nasty about it. I think they finally did wind up selling things to them as they walked by, but not letting them go through their territory. Or maybe, if depending how you understand the Bible, finally they got afraid enough to let him through, but their initial reaction was hostile. So in this case, he not only had a hostile reaction, but he was willing to back it up. Excuse me. Verse 21. So I'm going to go back to verse 21, what the Egyptians said. But he sent messengers to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I have not come against you this day, but against the house with which I have war. For God commanded me to make haste, refrain from meddling with God. Who is with me, lest he destroy you?" Well, it turns out the Egyptians lost that battle. So, but the Chaldeans were on the rise. But as I said, it wasn't Judah's responsibility to help the Chaldeans. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he might fight with him. So I suppose he went to war, but didn't want to look obviously like the king, so that there would be a lot of attention drawn against him. He was trying to, be part of the battle, but yet at the same time not be so obvious as that right away he'd become a target. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he might fight with him, and did not heed the words of Necho from the mouth of God. So here we see God had inspired Necho, to make those comments to him, and as a warning, God had warned him. So he came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. Now that's interesting, the valley of Megiddo. That's a decisive location, and you read about it in the book of Revelation. There's going to be a gathering there of armies who will then march down into Jerusalem, and evidently at the Kidron Valley will meet their defeat from the second coming of Jesus Christ. But they will gather first at Megiddo before they go south, as you read in Revelation, I believe the 16th chapter. Anyway, nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he might fight with him, and he did not heed the words of Necho from the mouth of God. So he came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. And the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am severely wounded." Perhaps he was overconfident because of the promise that God gave him. But God told him, "I'm going to bury you at a time when your country's at peace." And that was the case. That was the case. The Egyptians had no desires to conquer Judah, to attack Judah, to fight with Judah. They were just marching through. They were on their way to the Euphrates River. And so once Josiah died and the battle was over, his country was at peace. He was buried in a country that was at peace. The Egyptians just kept on going. God kept his promise. The Egyptians didn't take a detour and say and decide, now that we've defeated Josiah, let's rampage through Judah. They didn't. God had promised Josiah, you're going to die at a time of peace. So once the Egyptians dealt with him, they just kept right on going. But meantime, he was killed. Very sad. So his reign ended prematurely, and that was the end of the righteous King Josiah, and that meant Judah was going to be going down and out. Nevertheless, let's go to verse 23. And the archer shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am severely wounded." His servants therefore took him out of that chariot and put him in the second chariot that he had, and they brought him to Jerusalem. So he died and was buried in one of the tombs of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Now, in 3 weeks from the time I'm recording this message, roughly 3 weeks from the time I'm recording this message, Jews around the world are going to gather, and they're going to read the book of Exile, the book of Lamentations. And it may very well be that the book of Lamentations began not as an account historically of what happened in 587 BC with the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of Zedekiah, etc. But it began, the book of Lamentations, as a prophecy of what was going to happen. Let's look at verse 25. Jeremiah also lamented for Josiah. And to this day, all the singing men and the singing women speak of Josiah in their lamentations. They made it a custom in Israel, and indeed they are written in the laments. Well, is King Josiah mentioned in the book of Lamentations? I believe he is, in terms of an understanding of Lamentations 4 and verse 20. Let's finish up here. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and his goodness, according to what was written in the law of the Eternal, and his deeds from first to last, and they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. We do have, of course, some material here in 2 Chronicles, and as I said, there's material in 2 Kings, and there was I would suppose other material that is not part of the canon of Scripture, which was recorded at some point, may or may not ever be found this side of the millennium. But I want to go now to Lamentations, the 4th chapter and the 20th verse. And although this could apply to Zedekiah, we know that at this time of year was the time in 587 when Zedekiah fled and was captured, and you can read about what happened to him in Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings 25. But however it was worded originally, it may have originally applied to Josiah. I'm in Lamentations 4:20. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Eternal, the Mashiach. The kings of Judah were anointed. Jesus Christ, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, who's the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who's a descendant humanly of David. He is the Messiah, the anointed, Mashiach, Christos, the Christ. But here we have, the anointed of the Eternal, Mashiach Adonai. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Eternal, was caught in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. So yes, it could be referring to the fact that they felt that Zedekiah would possibly be, as their king, would keep them safe, and he was captured and taken into captivity, and died in captivity, as far as I know. But here, this may originally apply to Josiah. He was in a sense taken. He was taken from them. He was taken early, prematurely from them. His reign ended long before it might have, because of an error in judgment that he made. And so they felt that he was righteous and they would be at peace as long as he reigned, which was true. But once his reign came to an end, then Judah, unfortunately, was not able to maintain the righteous standards of King Josiah, and things went, as you could read, from bad to worse. You could read in chapter 36 of 2 Chronicles a summary of the situation. You could read more about it, as I said, in 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah 52, and elsewhere. So unfortunately, he made the wrong decision, and his career ended prematurely, and the nation went into a period extreme decline, climaxing in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the captivity of the king, which at this season of the year was taking place. And as a result, we have fast days climaxing in the fast of the 9th of Ab, sometimes observed on the 10th. There's a period of time between the 7th and the 10th of the 5th month, from the 7th of Ab to the 10th of Ab, when Jerusalem was being destroyed. So between the 7th and 10th is when these events occurred, and the fast day was fixed for the 9th. It's called the fast of the 5th month in Zechariah, the 8th chapter. And so begins the tale of exile, an exile which has not yet come to an end. So at this time of the year, we can look back at the historical events that eventually lead to an exile, which fortunately was partially restored. The house of Judah did come back from 70 years of exile, did come back to the Holy Land. But then again, in 70 AD 70, at the same time of year, when the Jews around the world were reading the Book of Lamentations, their second temple was being destroyed, and a second exile took place. And from that exile, only recently have the Jews begun to return from that exile. And what we're seeing now is the returning from that exile. But that exile has not yet fully ended. It will fully end, and Judah will be fully restored when Jesus Christ returns to his people. When the anointed of the eternal, the Mashiach, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, does come back to, at that time, once again, his people will be in need of deliverance. Evidently, from the indication of prophecy is that before the coming of Jesus Christ, the Israelis will be in a very severe situation where they will need to be delivered, and they will be very happy to see their Messiah coming, and they will be very happy to greet him. And of course, eventually, if you read in Zechariah 12 and Revelation 1, he will be revealed to be the one that was crucified anciently in Jerusalem, or just outside the city. He'll be revealed as the son of the carpenter, the rabbi who taught and allowed himself to be arrested and tortured and killed, but then who was resurrected and is now returning as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That will be the final end of their exile. And in Matthew 23, and then they will be restored to a nation that will be, as it says in Exodus, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. In Matthew 23 and verse 37. Let's go to verse 39. Matthew 23 and verse 39. Jesus said before his arrest and crucifixion, he said to his people, "For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai," till you recite the beginning of Psalm 118:26 and apply it to me, as you did when I first entered the city. But then, unfortunately, things went very negative after that. But here's what he tells them. "For I say to you," Matthew 23, verse 39, "you shall see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Eternal." So we can look backward to a time when things went very negatively for the house of Judah, and an extended period of exile began. And then we can look forward to the conclusion of that exile, knowing that God has promised not only to fully restore the house of Judah, but really to fully restore humankind to a right relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Looking backward, looking forward. All the best to you and yours.